Hey guys, tonight we drift into shimmering waters and vast paddies where once the mighty Khmer Empire engineered whole landscapes to float on monsoon floods. Yes, you probably won't survive this metaphorical voyage unsoaked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And go ahead, post your location and local time in the comments so I know where my fellow nocturnal explorers are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin on the humid plain of the Angkor region in present-day Cambodia, where the haze of pre-dawn whisks off the jungle leaves, and you trudge along raised embankments that encircle flat, water-filled rice fields. The air is thick with the scent of wet peat and lotus blooms, and if you listen closely, you'll hear frogs croaking like a distant applause. In this watery stage, the Khmer rulers didn't just build temples. No, they rewrote the land itself. They turned flooding into a feature, not a flaw. Historians still argue whether the main impetus was irrigation, ritual, or simply environmental control. In the 9th century CE, a workshop of monarchs and engineers looking at the monsoon's excess might have said, "Okay, water comes too fast, drains too quickly. Let's trap it, tame it, use it." The region floods from May to October under the monsoon, then enters a dry season where water becomes precious. The plains that we now see as archaeological sites were once rhythmic with harvests, canals, reservoirs, and the hum of human ambition. Picture yourself, literally. You're walking along the edge of a massive reservoir, the soil beneath your sandals slightly springy from saturation, as embossed with tiny shells and root furrows. The sky is overcast, heavy with potential rain, and you wonder, how did one civilization think to build something so big, so bold, in a world where water is chaos? The Khmer Empire, CE 802 to 1431, didn't just survive in this place. They thrived by redefining their relation with water. One mainstream historical fact: they built enormous reservoirs, or bares, to collect monsoon water for irrigation and stabilizing their cityscape. A quirky, lesser-mentioned tidbit: some of these bares were shallow, only a few meters deep, yet stretched for many kilometers. So when villagers used parts of them for fishing, the fish literally felt like they were swimming on the prow of an inland sea. And yes, scholars still debate whether bare's primary function was agricultural or ceremonial. Some argue they symbolize the mythic sea around Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology. As you wander past one of these ancient embankments, you realize how the Khmer transformed their plain from a problem, monsoon deluge and dry spells, into their engine of empire. The surface of one bare mirrors the sky so perfectly that rice fields gave the illusion of floating islands. You trudge forward, watching ripples, imagining paddies just beyond the rise. In that moment, you sense why this landscape became the heart of an empire, not because they fought with swords the hardest, but because they harnessed what nature threw at them. By the time this opening section ends, you're no longer just outside the empire. You're in its rhythm: flood, store, move, grow. And the stage is set for deeper dives into how exactly they did it. You've now walked the edge of empire water, and tonight you drift deeper into the enormous reservoirs, or bares, the Khmer built, quiet giants of earth and innovation that turned seasonal monsoon chaos into stored potential. You slip quietly into the next layer of their story, so let's wander onward. Imagine, you step across a dike the width of a small road, the muddy embankment rising a meter or two above the surrounding plain. On one side, the water glistens under the broken cloud cover, flat as glass. On the other, fields lie pocked with rain pools, waiting. You follow this ridge and feel the faint sway of water beneath your feet, a subtle vibration like the hum of a dormant machine. The Khmer weren't just building ponds. They were relocating enormous volumes of water, redirecting monsoons, writing treaties of stone and soil with water itself. The first of the great bares was built in the late 9th century under the reign of Yasovarman I, who moved the capital of the empire to a new site on the banks of the Siem Reap River. One example, The barre known as East Barre measured roughly 7.5 kilometers by 1.8 kilometers and held tens of millions of cubic meters of water. That's not a puddle, that's a man-made inland sea. You sense the scale. To build something like this, you had to raise dikes, dig trenches, channel inflow from rivers and monsoon floods, manage outflow so the embankments didn't break. The engineers of the time, anonymous though they are, laid out long, gentle gradients so water would spread, not rush. They built feeder canals and spillways. According to modern archaeological summaries, rivers were dredged and straightened into canals and vast water storage reservoirs. Dikes were built across the floodplain to deflect and store floodwaters to irrigate crops during the dry season. You are tracing the line between plain and ambition. Yet historians still argue whether these barres were purely practical or also symbolic. Some scholars believe they were built to store water for agriculture and urban use. Others believe they primarily represented a cosmological ocean around the Divine King's Temple Mountain. So you walk this ridge thinking, maybe you're inside a water machine, maybe inside a myth in physical form. Let's pause for a quirky, lesser-mentioned tidbit. One of these reservoirs, the West Barre, built in the early 11th century under rulers such as Udaya di Tavarman II, measured about 8 kilometers by 2.2 kilometers and held perhaps 50 to 80 million cubic meters of water. But here's where it gets playful. Today, locals sometimes swim and picnic along its southern shore. This ancient reservoir doubles as a weekend lake beach. Imagine that, an imperial reservoir built for kings and gods, now hosting families with inner tubes. The ghosts of engineers would probably raise an eyebrow. You stroll past its longest embankment, the sunlight low and golden, the water's glass surface, occasionally broken by a fish or a bird skimming the echo of emptiness. You think about how many tons of earth moved, how many lives hammered and dug, and how the embankment may have been built layer by layer, filled with laterite blocks, with clay, with vegetation, carefully compacted so the flood would not wash it away. The plain here is flat, so flat that even a slight gradient counts. Engineers laid out these barres on a near east-west axis, a deliberate orientation matching temple layouts and possibly harnessing seasonal flood flows. You feel the precision, the labor, the quiet power. Behind you, you hear the rush of water channeled into a feeder canal, a broad arm reaching out from the barre to the rice fields beyond. You follow it a bit, walking beside the water, noting how the edge is carefully trimmed, maybe with laterite stones, maybe with vegetation, and let the water creep and calm. You imagine how in the wet season the overflow came, how the barre filled like a bathtub, and then during the dry season, the flows were metered out through the canal network, ensuring rice paddies didn't dry out. The system allowed the entire surrounding plain to become not just rain-fed, but managed. And here's a mainstream historical fact. Archaeological cores sampled from the West Barre show that sedimentation rates changed markedly in the 14th century, meaning the water management system was weakening as the empire declined. That raises the question, the same precision that built the system, could it maintain it forever? Historians still argue whether the maintenance burden of such vast infrastructure played a role in the empire's eventual fall. Then you imagine the workers, thousands of conscripted people carrying clay, sand, piling dikes, shaping embankments, clearing feeder canals. The king's decree echoing, "Build us a sea on land." Something almost extravagant, but also necessary. In some places, you'll still see the flattened outline of barres, their edges faintly visible from satellites, a ghost of ambition. And you think, what must the world have looked like when the water still ran full, when the mirror lake of a barre reflected the temple towers stretching into clouds? Now you stand at the interface of temple, water, and plain, realizing that the barres were both practical and symbolic. They were reservoirs and statements. They were power apparatus and spiritual stage sets. And so, as our narrative glides forward, you carry this duality in your mind, the hydraulic engineering of empire and the mythic architecture of kings. You cross a narrow causeway linking the embankment to a small temple island in the middle of the barre, because yes, many barres had temples built on artificial islands at their center. There's your reminder. precious water and sacred stone, side by side. And while you wander, you feel the Bare's full scale, its logic, its beauty, its sheer audacity. Before we move on to the next layer, where the canals spread and the rice rode the flood, we pause here in the hum of water and earth. The reservoirs are built. The reflect pool of empire glows quietly in the dusk. Sensors of power and devotion folded together. With that, you'll return to the edges of the paddies soon, but only after sipping this sight. You tread into the labyrinth of canals now, the silent arteries of empire pulsing beneath the flooded paddies. The great reservoirs, the Bares you visited, serve as the beating heart, but it is through the network of channels that the life of the Khmer Empire truly flowed. Tonight you trace one such canal under the dappled moonlight, you, the solitary explorer in a world driven by water.